people to pay money, calling it a property tax, calling it a water tax, call it whatever you like, it has to come out of their incomes. So effectively, in reality, substantively, it is an income tax. So there's a few days to go, Minister. Get the word back to the big man that he can do it. It just takes courage and a proper substantive understanding of what's going on. Do you know how many people were asleep without home on Grafton Street yesterday morning? I spoke to Michael, who sells the newspapers on the mobile stand. He sells the magazines Phoenix and so on, the newspapers, at the junction of Johnson Lane, or Johnson Court and Grafton Street. He told me when he was going to work early with his newspapers. He counted personally 40 human souls sleeping rough without a home on Grafton Street. That is how all these losses, the graphs, the ups and downs, the pluses and minuses of the economy translates into lives, human lives in our society. And there is merit in people at the higher levels of income having a little bit of extra to pay till we steer around the ship. Because we have about 500 million of necessary funding and expenses to be given to the health service to correct the ship in real terms of people waiting for operations, waiting for MRI scans. Do you know, if you're on the public health system and you have serious symptoms in and around your head or brain, to get an MRI scan, the waiting list is 2 years at the moment. 2 years, unless you've got private health insurance. There's no need for that in our society. The CEOs, the CFOs, and the COOs of the foreign FDI multinationals would actually, it would amaze me that they wouldn't be able to advocate the rightness and justification of taking on board a 3% reported profits levy per year for 3 years in a national recovery effort for this country. Absolutely certain of it. I've asked many of them. Some of them are my own contemporaries. They wouldn't blink. But the Conservative establishment is frightened of its own shadow at times.
Gone home, 2 minutes from me.
And that's a shame. That's a shame. As regards, do you remember I mentioned just briefly the potential for professional indemnity exposure if we make the management of all of this arrangement wrong and funds started to sue us because our regulator was remiss or whatever, the management on site went astray? Well, here's a few thoughts to think about. 2 banks alone in the United States, based in the United States, Citigroup, Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, the combination of their fines and penalties that they paid in 1 year alone last year and settlements between them was about $110 billion. And you know, fines, penalties and settlements arise out of bad operations or misbehavior or breaking rules, or, well, it means Citigroup have, you know, a reddened face in so many parts of the world where they operated. Tim Geithner talks about it in his book. But we should not be pied-pipered into something by buzzwords, jargon, technospeak, etc. We should be able to say, explain it. What exactly? Because it's all simple at the end of the day. You know, it's like the subprime slicing and dicing of mortgages and, you know, securitizing. People swoon over it. Should, you know, even at home on the familiar forecourt, people say, oh, don't talk to me about car engines. Lift the bonnet, that's for an engineer. But it's not rocket science. If you take it simply, there is an engine with cylinders. Cylinders are spaces where pistons go up and down. because petrol is injected, ignited, explodes, moving the pistons, which in turn drives the rods, that drives the shafts, that drives the wheels.
Thank you, Deputy.
And finance is the same. But we don't actually ask enough questions. That's why we got into the mess that we did. Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. And now I call on the Minister of State to reply.
And Corla, and I'd like to, begin by agreeing with Deputy Mathews. We don't often ask enough questions, and it's not me you need to tell it to. I'm not the one glossing over anything. I've been here for the entire debate. I've been here to hear everybody's contribution, and I'm here now to respond to some of the issues that were raised, and it's great to see such a great turnout, because this legislation does matter. In the words of Deputy Barrett, it is serious stuff. I agree, it's serious stuff. We are talking about a sector that employs many people. We're talking about regimes, and you're right, they shouldn't be overly complicated. We should scrutinise them, we should tear them down, but we're talking about serious, meaty policy issues here. And Deputy Doherty raised the issue. Who wrote this? And you did too, Deputy Mathews. It's perfectly acceptable. Just give me. I'm going to be up against a clock here, and you're 20 minutes. So just give me a moment. Let's be very clear. It's fine for government to consult. It's fine for the public sector to consult. It's perfectly appropriate, in my view, to have consultative forums in place, which is what the Clearinghouse Group is. But it's here, on the floor of this House, and on the floor of the other House, and in the committee rooms, that we make the decisions. And yes, the Clearinghouse Group contains stakeholders, and yes, those stakeholders from industry meet with stakeholders from the public sector, and yes, they talk about what we need to do to have a robust and competitive financial services sector. But it is us, the elected people, the representatives of the people, elected by the people, who make those decisions, and that's the purpose of the legislative process. So let's not try to create any sort of conspiracy theories here. This is legislation that has been steered by the Department of Finance, in conjunction with the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation, and in close contact with the Central Bank of Ireland as well, because we have, and I think this was a theme that came up throughout the discussion, we have a lot to learn in relation to the regulatory mistakes of the past and ensuring that they don't happen again. So I'll try and endeavour to address as many of the issues as I can, but I do genuinely want to thank all deputies for their contributions. I thought we had a very constructive engagement. I thought we had an interesting array of points made, some which I think were very reasonable, some which I don't think were so reasonable. And I'm looking forward to a more detailed consideration of the provisions at committee stage. I think I'd like to just begin with some of the comments of Deputy McGrath, who declared his support for the legislation, which I'm very grateful for, and he's quite correct. We have been through serious financial storms over the last few years, which is how he described it. It is a fast-moving area, the area of financial services. We do need to, in his words, up our game. Everybody, the government, the Oireachtas, industry, all public bodies, and that's why I was appointed by the Taoiseach to be the first Minister of State with responsibility for the financial services sector in almost 20 years. Because you need to have political oversight and you need to have political leadership in these areas. That's why we are preparing a new financial services strategy that will be published early next year, a strategy that will be action-based. And I very much welcome submissions and thoughts from all members on all sides of this House in terms of how we need to position Ireland to ensure that we continue to sell this country as a great location in which to bring international banking and continue to create jobs for our people and investment in this country. I'd like to respond to some of the issues raised. Deputy Doherty raised questions about AGMs not being held under the provisions of this legislation. And I'd just like to reiterate, as I did in my opening remarks, while directors can decide not to hold an AGM, members holding 10% can demand that one is held. I think it also should be remembered that the investors will have daily access to the net asset value of the scheme, and so they are in a different position to shareholders of trading companies. I do think that is an important differentiation to make. Deputy Doherty also said that we needed further answers about the proposed removing of some elements from the company's registration office to the central bank. I think that's a very reasonable proposition, and it's one that I'd be very happy to address with him and with others at committee stage of this legislation. We had a number of comments from Deputy McGrath, Deputy Boyd Barrett, Deputy Ross, yourself, perhaps Deputy Mathews, in relation to concerns about regulation. And I just want to reiterate on the record of this House, all ICAVs will be subject to regulation by the central bank. We've already discussed the various European directives that they're under, and you make points about skill sets and resourcing, which I think are reasonable points, Deputy Mathews. But this bill is not about deregulation, as Deputy Ross liked to allude to. This bill is about asking, have we the correct structure in place? It's not about changing the regulation. Is the structure correct? Should we view funds the same way as we view stereotypical companies, or should we have a different structure in place? Should we look at what our competitors are doing in other countries? Should we learn from that? Or should we stay as we are? That's the debate. I'm proposing in this bill that we look at putting a new structure in place, the ICAV. Deputy Doherty asked about the origin of the bill, and I think I've addressed that. It is a case that a range of stakeholders were involved, obviously, in its gestation. This includes the funds industry, it includes its advisors, it includes the public service, but it was very much driven by the Department of Finance in close consultation with the Central Bank and with my colleague, the Minister for Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation. Deputy Boyd Barrett talked about a range of things, and we come at this from a very different ideological point of view, and I think you would accept that. We live in a global economy, though. There are already funds based here in this country. And I tell you, deputies could do a worse thing than go and visit some of these places. Go and actually talk to the men and the women, the young men and women in many cases, the Irish people who are working in these industries. They're not bad people. They're not working in a bad industry. These are honest, honourable, well-qualified, skilled people from this country. From this country. And I know Deputy Mathews might have an issue with their bosses. But these are not faceless people. They're working in offices, and as I made the point, and so did Deputy McGrath, they're not just working in offices in Dublin or in the Docklands, in the IFSC, they're working in so many communities across this country, in Drogheda, in Naas, in Cork, in Wexford. So let's just acknowledge that when we're having a conversation here, that, yes, mistakes have been made in this industry. Many mistakes have been made in this House, by the way. Doesn't mean everybody in this House is a bad person or is incompetent. We have many fine people that I'm proud to say, as Irish people, are making a positive contribution, and we're not allowed to name people in this House. This bill, Deputy Boyd Barrett was concerned perhaps that this is about avoiding tax or avoiding regulation. I'd suggest in advance at committee stage he reads it and comes back and has an exchange with us at committee stage, because there's 64 sections, as I alluded to in my opening remarks, that give rise to an offence in this bill. In relation to the whole issue of tax advantages for investors in ICAV, it's important to reiterate that while investors in UCITS or alternative investment fund structures like ICAVs can avail or may be able to avail of the US check-the-box tax treatment, which is already available to unit trusts, to common contractual funds or to investment limited partnerships. It is important to remember that, firstly, the tax treatment of any fund structure is a matter for each jurisdiction where the liability arises, and secondly, that such look-through vehicles have long been available to fund promoters in Ireland and across Europe. I was asked rather, are we just putting this legislation in place to compete with Luxembourg? I think I was asked by Deputy Doherty. My colleague, Deputy Toomey, alluded to this. Yes, Luxembourg has a similar vehicle, but so does Italy, so does Spain, so does France, so does the UK, so does Germany, so does the USA. So I actually think Deputy McGrath sums this up quite well when he said this is an effort, a collective effort that I believe we should make in this House, and that the government wishes for us to make, to catch up. That was, I think, the phrase of Deputy McGrath. Let's catch up. Let's make sure that our structures in this country are fit for purpose. Let's make the jobs of the people who are travelling the world promoting this country as a location for jobs and investment. Let's make that job easier by making sure that our structures are in place, like the structures that are in place for our competitors. If we don't do that, we will get left behind. I want to just make sure I've answered as many questions as I can, but I mean the ICAV bill should not be seen in isolation as a technical exercise to make the lives of fund managers or their accountants or their lawyers easier in some way. The intention of this legislation is to bring Ireland to a place where we're competing on an even footing with our other European fund domiciles. We should not cede ground to our competitors when this could mean a loss of investment in Ireland. I did not get appointed as a Minister of State with responsibility for international banking in the IFSC to cede ground to our competitors. I got appointed to provide political oversight, to bring the public sector together and to make sure that we have fit-for-purpose structures, that we have innovative products in place and that we are ready to compete for more jobs and investment. Whilst one can't be certain as to the precise number of new jobs that will result from the availability of the ICAV structure, past evidence is that industry makes use of what vehicles have been made available, and the fact that it will not be necessary to apply to ICAV's unnecessary company law requirements arising from EU obligations will indeed be a bonus. As I've said in my earlier comments, the bill as drafted cross-applies a number of provisions of parts of the Companies Act, and on further reflection it may be desirable to set out some of these regimes in more extensive form in the bill. I expect to conclude my consideration of where this might be most appropriate in the near future, and if necessary I'll bring forward proposals at committee stage in this regard, and obviously consider amendments from colleagues on all sides of this House. We had Deputy Ross admit that he sometimes gets things wrong. I think he got some things wrong today. Because in an effort to come into this House and name an individual or name a series of individuals and apply, you know,